From the late 8th century through the late 11th century, Viking customs were quite bizarre and uncommon. Marriage was the heart of family structure in Viking culture, hence the intricate nature of Viking wedding rituals. According to many of the myths and folklore to which historians attribute their knowledge of Viking weddings, each tradition and ritual was deemed necessary to earn the blessings of the gods, an important step on the path to becoming a parent and continuing the Viking bloodline. It is no surprise that Vikings were fearsome fighters who had a history of attacking states as well as slaughtering their people. These ferocious seafarers could slay countless people and carry out certain brutal traditional killings. This is clear that the Viking era was filled with certain severe Norse religious ceremonies as well as some bizarre customs that Vikings performed. Ladies were held in high regard and a significant amount of authority in their community, and this was totally unexpected. They resided in a very well-organized democratic system that occasionally participated in scary Norse customs. Let's discuss the strange Viking wedding traditions and rituals that seem too shocking to believe. This is History Rediscovered. To support, please subscribe. Marriage was an important feature of Viking culture. Viking weddings, also known as Norse weddings, united not only the bride and groom, but it allied both of their families. Wedding celebrations usually lasted a week, and were usually held in the summer to avoid the snowy winters that made it impossible to travel to the wedding location. The families arranged the marriages, and the bride and groom didn't speak much to each other before the wedding. Although Vikings married for economic and political reasons, marriage opened the possibility of having trueborn children. Being able to have children was crucial during Viking times because the more children they had, the more they could farm and the more wealth they could acquire. During the Viking Age, girls married as young as 12 years old. This was probably because the average Viking lifespan was so only 40 years, on average. Vikings married for legal and financial reasons rather than love. For Vikings, marriage wasn't just a union of the couple, but of families. Because of this, the wedding was a long process. Unions had long-lasting legal implications in Norse culture, affecting everything from property holdings to inheritance. Therefore, numerous negotiations were carried out before the terms of a marriage were formally agreed upon. At the start of marriage negotiations, the groom's family, along with legal delegates, got together to determine the bride's dowry and the groom's financial assets, set the date of the wedding, and negotiate the wedding gift from the groom's parents. The groom's family, council, and any important local figures to whom they had connections brought proposals to the bride's family, promising to support and assist them, while agreeing upon mutually beneficial terms for the marriage. In the lead-up to the wedding, Norse brides and grooms were separated so they could strip away their former selves before entering their new lives together. Brides were attended by other married female relatives and friends, including their mothers and their married sisters, to prepare them for marriage. For the bride, this meant being stripped of old clothing and any symbols of her unwed status, such as her kransen, a gilt circlet worn by Scandinavian girls. The kransen, symbolic of virginity, would be stored for the bride's future daughter. During the wedding ceremony, the kransen was replaced with a bridal crown. The bride washed herself while she was imprisoned in a bathhouse, where bathing was customary. Women frequently covered themselves with birch twigs to cause sweating, which symbolically washed away a bride's virginhood. Hot stones were placed in the tub to create steam. The bride entered cold water to close her pores after the bath, which put an end to the washing procedure. Women were accompanied during these preparations by their mother, married sisters, and other married female family members and acquaintances. Setting a date required numerous considerations and could delay weddings for years. A Viking wedding's date-setting method had its own steps. Friday was traditionally the day of the wedding because Frigg, the Norse goddess of marriage, considers it to be a holy day. Most weddings lasted a week, and guests made the trip to the wedding location. Winter weddings were not conceivable because of how difficult it was to travel. The right lodgings, getting enough food and drinks for everyone present during the ceremony, and making a special ale for the bride and groom to sip throughout the ceremony were all other factors to take into account. A wedding might occasionally have an extremely extended timeline due to all of these factors. While most marriages went place a year after all discussions were concluded, waiting periods of 3 years were not unheard of for Vikings in Iceland, whose frequent visits to Norway made it impossible to choose a date that worked for everyone. The bride and groom wore no particular attire, but they did both carry symbolic objects. Dressing for the ceremony was the last step in a Viking bride's pre-wedding preparations. Viking brides didn't dress in ornate robes or costumes. Her hair and crown were the ornamental focal points instead. In Viking society, a woman's hair was particularly essential and a sign of her seductiveness. The longer, the better. Brides wore a wedding crown in place of the kransen, which was often a family treasure. These crowns were typically constructed of silver and wrapped with silk garland in red and green. They were often embellished with crystals and intricate motifs like crosses and clover leaves. Some bridal crowns that are still in use today are exquisitely fashioned from wheat and straw and decorated with flowers. The groom changed into his wedding attire after completing the bathing procedure. A Viking groom was not obligated to wear a specific outfit or elaborate gown, just like the bride. He did, however, bring his newly acquired sword to the ritual, as well as perhaps a hammer or an axe, which are also Thor symbols. Such a tool was seen as a sign of his control over the union and was thought to guarantee a happy union. Wedding ceremonies often began with a sacrifice. The premarital rites were completed, and then the ceremony started. The religious ritual would start with calling the attention of the gods and goddesses, a process that may have entailed a sacrifice and incantation. This was followed by the exchange of dowry and munda, wedding price, in front of witnesses. If a sacrifice was required, Vikings offered a goat to the fertility god Thor, a sow to Freyja, a boar to Freya, or a horse to Freya. A basin containing the animal's blood was set up as an altar. The blood was used to dip a bundle of fir twigs, which were then used to sprinkle the couple with it to bestow the god's blessings. Animals were occasionally given as living presents. These animals were revered. Viking couples exchanged swords in addition to rings. During a Viking wedding, the groom presented an ancestral sword to his bride, which he kept for any future sons they might have. The bride then gifted the groom a sword of her ancestors, symbolizing a transfer of a father's protection of a bride to the husband. This gift exchange symbolized sacred union, sanctified by mystic rites. The bride and groom then exchanged rings to further consecrate their wedding vows, offering rings to one another on the hilt of their new swords. At their post-wedding feast, the bride and groom were required by law to share a bride ale. Once they had done so, their union was legally binding. The ale, which was typically a honey-based mead, was required to be consumed over the couple's honeymoon in order for the wedding to proceed. The bride gave the groom the first course in a cup resembling the Swedish ksa, also referred to as a loving cup. The bride may present the ale while reciting a formal verse. The groom hammered over the brew and dedicated it to Thor before toasting to Odin and consuming it. He then sipped and passed the cup to his bride, who made a toast to Freyja before drinking. The couple was escorted to bed by at least 6 witnesses so they could consummate their marriage. Those who did not marry were shunned. Scandinavian men and women who never married because of their sexual orientation were shunned from society, a regressive view that mostly stemmed from the society's emphasis on reproduction and farming. As long as a Viking married a partner of the opposite sex and produced offspring, however, their extramarital activities were generally ignored.